We would like to thank you for joining our session that is now getting ready to start. We have Troubleshoot Like a Microsoft Engineer presented by Tim Chapman and moderated by myself, Jason Brimhall. We will be doing a little bit of a caveman type of thing where I will tell Tim when to click so you have a smoother presentation here. So please accept our apologies for that. Thank you, Tim. If you need technical assistance, you have a quick demo right there on the screen of what to do. Go ahead and type your question in the question box and send it to the organizers and the staff, and we can try to assist you with that. You may have some Zoom issues. Just try to adjust your Zoom appropriately. Go ahead and click. Most important thing besides Tim's presentation is the sponsors that have made this all possible. Please, if you run into people from Dell or Microsoft, give them a nice resounding thank you. Go ahead. And we also ask that you make plans to attend Summit 2014. There is a special discount code that you can see there on the screen. It is 24HOP14. You will get $200 off of your admission into Summit. That's a pretty decent savings at this point in the game. You will have plenty of access into lots of sessions and technical content, as well as networking at Summit in Seattle. Again, that is going to be in November. Presenting today is Tim Chapman. He is a Microsoft Certified Master. He can be reached at timchap@microsoft.com. You can follow him on Twitter at ChapmanDo. And you can also see some of the stuff that he writes at the SQL PFE blog. He is a premier field engineer for Microsoft.
Premier field engineer. Yep.
And he has quite a bit of experience with helping customers with performance tuning and on-the-spot diagnostics. Go ahead and click. And that brings us to the time where we will now be handing over to Tim to give this presentation. If you have questions, please go ahead and forward them on to me. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending my session today, Troubleshoot Like a Microsoft Engineer. Originally, it was going to be myself and another engineer, Denzil Ribeiro, but Denzil wasn't able to make it today, so you just have me instead. Today's session is part of a session that Denzil and I are going to do at the as a pre-con at the summit called Troubleshoot Like a Microsoft Engineer, and it's going to be a full-day pre-con where we talk about a lot of different troubleshooting techniques, and also we're going to do some hands-on troubleshooting. And so what we're going to be talking about today is some of the tools that we Microsoft engineers use whenever we are troubleshooting customer systems. And not only am I going to focus on the tools, but I'm going to make it, hopefully, by the end of the session, very apparent that you can use these tools, which are freely available out on Codeplex, to manage and customize and do your own SQL Server diagnostic captures. And hopefully by the end you'll be able to get up and running on that. So we're going to start off, we're going to talk about SQL Diag and Diag Manager. Then we're going to dig into SQL Nexus. We're going to talk about PAL towards the end of the session. I'm not going to talk about PAL a lot, but we're going to mention the performance analysis of tools. Then I'm just going to show you how to configure these tools so you can get the data that you want out of them. Because if you're here at this session talking or wanting to hear about how to troubleshoot like a Microsoft engineer, you want to know about how to collect your own data, hopefully, and hopefully by the end of the session, that's what we'll divulge. Any questions? Just shoot them into the chat window. We're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the talk to go over them, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as we go. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about SQL Diag, because this is the tool from which most other tools are going to be based upon. SQL Diag is a command line tool that ships with SQL Server, and this is the vehicle from which we capture data. So if you're working with a Microsoft engineer and they send you something called a PSS Diag, PSS Diag is just a wrapper for sending a XML configuration file to SQL Diag so that SQL Diag can collect this information for you. So any installation of SQL that you have, you're going to have an exe out there called SQLdiag.exe in the installation directory, the bin directory of wherever you have SQL Server installed. And I have a little graphic up there that shows you installation path, that you can double click on this tool and it'll start collecting information for your SQL Server instances on the machine. You need to have it on the machine where SQL Server is installed. But the real power of SQL Diag comes from these configuration files that you can pass to it. So SQL Diag can collect DMV information, perfmon information, pretty much any type of information that you want to capture on a server. SQL Diag is able to go out and grab it. And that's going to be the basis of this talk today. How can we get the information that we want to on any of the servers on our system, capture it, and then do something with it? Okay, and it all comes with that customization that we're going to talk about. You can add these custom collectors, and again, these can be VB scripts, they can be T-SQL scripts, any type of script for the most part that you want. You're able to capture that with SQL Diag. And I'm going to show you a tool called Diag Manager in the next slide that you can use to customize basically these captures from SQL Diag. So here's Diag Manager. Diag Manager is a tool that you get off of CodePlex, and it allows you to create essentially these configurations to pass to SQL Diag to collect the information that you want. Whenever you grab this from CodePlex and you go through these configurations, it's going to create something called a cabinet file, and you're going to want to take that cabinet file and you're going to want to move that to whatever server you're going to capture the information from, and you're going to have to run that cabinet file from there, which is basically just a big bunch of files that we'll use to extract data. Now there's a couple of things that I want to point out with Diag Manager here. First is going to be, let me find my little pointy tool here. First is going to be towards this left-hand side of the screen, the platform. You want to pick the platform for which SQL Server is installed on. It's either going to be a 32-bit, and you see these less and less these days, or it's going to be a 64-bit server. And this is almost certainly going to be the choice that you're going to pick, this AMD 64. Choose this option first, because if you choose this option after you pick some of these other options, it resets them. Okay. The issue type, you're going to usually stick to the default so long as you're troubleshooting something on the database engine itself and nothing analysis services related. If you're on a cluster, you may be inclined to actually enter in the machine name or the virtual machine name and the instance name on the cluster. Usually I leave these as they are because I want to collect as much information as I can, and typically if there's more than one instance, I want to collect information from those instances as well. Right. So whenever I fire this up on a machine itself, if there are multiple instances, we'll collect information from those instances as well. Whenever I do run the capture itself, I want to make sure that I have administrator rights, just because SQL Server, not SQL Server, but Diag Manager and PSS Diag under the covers essentially is going to go out and collect that information, and some of the information it collects, it needs admin rights to grab it. And you can choose how you want to connect to SQL Server, whether it be through Windows authentication or SQL authentication. Typically I'm going to connect through Windows Auth because the account that I'm using or the account that the DBA is using on that machine is going to be an admin anyway. Now we'll get into the actual details that you want to capture on the server. Typically, the perfmon capture doesn't add a whole lot of overhead on the server itself, so I choose the defaults here. You can change the interval if you want, but for the most part I take the defaults and it captures most information that I need. I almost always capture perfmon information because there is a wealth of data in capturing perfmon information on a server, and so it's actually one of the first things that I look at whenever I'm trying to diagnose problems on the server. It gives me server level information along with SQL level information, and I can correlate those. Coming up here, we have, and I'm going to stick to the database engine today. I'm not going to talk about anything analysis services related. Here you may or you may not want to collect trace information. Typically I do not collect trace information because the more trace or events that you capture, you are adding extra overhead on the server, and there have been cases where I've seen that someone has collected way too many trace events and it's brought the server down to its knees. So typically I don't collect trace information, so I'll uncheck this box right here. Right. Then we'll come down to this custom diagnostics section, and this is where I like to spend most of my time. in this custom diagnostics, there are a number of scripts that you can right-click and modify, or actually just look at the details for these. And it's going to collect certain machine-level metrics on the server, as well as blocking scripts. There's a number of scripts that actually come with Diag Manager. Now, what's great about these custom diagnostics is if I right-click the My Collectors folder and go to Details, I can enter in my own SQL scripts to collect information. And this is probably, if there's anything that you take away from this particular presentation from 24 hours past, I want you to be able to do this. Because being able to do this, you can write your own scripts, whether they be DMV scripts or whatever, and you can collect pretty much whatever you want on a server. And then what I'm going to show you is once you've collected them, you can load that information up into a database through SQL Nexus, and then run your own diagnostic scripts against that data to have to be able to tell management or your DBA team or whoever what's wrong with the server. So so long as you can write it, you're almost certainly going to be able to capture it on a server through this custom collector. Now, the script that we just looked at, whenever I went to the details, it pops up this particular little screen right here. Now, if I had a lot of scripts that I wanted to look at, I could go through and I could enter all of them in here, and that would be fine. But at the end of the day, there is a Diag file, a custom Diag.xml file, that I can go and I can edit, and it shows me the path of that XML file up here in this toolbar. It shows me the path, so I can go and I can edit that file through a text editor, or however I want to modify it to include the scripts that I want to include. Right, so if I have 30 or 40 different scripts, I may not want to have to go in and type all of those in. I could go in, edit that XML file by hand, copy them out, do it through PowerShell. There's a number of ways that I can edit it to make it a much more efficient process. Right. Now you can see up here at the top of the screen, we see this PSS Diag Custom Collectors My Collectors folder. I'm going to show you the contents of that in a few minutes. It has a number of different files in there that are associated with PSS Diag. There's one folder called My Collectors, and you'll want to put your custom T-SQL scripts there. Okay, it's usually much quicker to do it through some sort of notepad editor or something like that rather than having to go through that UI to do it. Now the scripts that I want to capture information for, my T-SQL scripts, what I'm going to have to do in each one of these T-SQL scripts, I'm going to have to add, through a print statement, some sort of indicator that allows me to uniquely identify a result set. Now the reason I want to do this is because using this tag, here I'm just doing it for a backup history script. Using this tag, I can go and edit an XML file for SQL Nexus that will allow me to, any information that this select statement returns, I can load that into a SQL database automatically. I don't have to go out, I don't have to give it a schema, I don't have to create the tables. The SQL Nexus import system will go out, notice this tag, it will find all of these columns that it sees that it wants me to import, that it knows that I want to import. It will create a table for me automatically, and it will load the output from this text file, which I'll show you in a few minutes, into that table. So that's the real power of what I'm talking to you about today. I create a SQL script, I create a SQL Diag or a PSS Diag collection. I run that collection on my server. That server collects that information, puts it into a series of text files. Then once I have those text files, I'm going to be able to load that data up through SQL Nexus, and then I have all of that data that I've collected on my server in a central server somewhere else that I can run analysis on. Right, so you want to, if you have these scripts that you want to capture on your system, on your SQL servers, you'll want to add these to My Collectors. You're going to want to add a tag to them, and then you're going to use that tag to load that data up into SQL Nexus. Okay, so let's take a look at a quick demo here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to discard my annotations here. I'm going to go out and I have a VM set up called Analysis, and I have Diag Manager already installed. So what I did was I went out to codeplex.com, I grabbed Diag Manager, and I installed it. Okay, so it's one of those things that you have to install, and you're going to install this probably on a desktop somewhere or a server that you don't have production level information on, or a production system on. You don't have to install this particular application on your production level SQL servers. In fact, nothing that we're going to look at today you actually have to install on your production SQL servers. Right? So I'm going to choose 64-bit, and you'll notice up here at the top, zoom out a little bit, you'll notice up here at the top that I don't have SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2014. Now, the bad part is that what is out on CodePlex right now does not include those versions of SQL Server. However, there is a small change that you'll need to make to an XML file to allow you to collect from those types of SQL Server instances, and it's not a big deal whatsoever to do it, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. All right. So I want to collect from a 64-bit instance. I'm just going to leave the machine name and the instance name the way that it is. I'm not going to collect trace information. I'm going to come down to My Collectors, and I'm going to right-click and I'm going to go to Details. Now I already have all the scripts loaded up that I want to collect, and these are the actual scripts that whenever I work with customers, this is all the information that I gather from them. So these are all my custom scripts, and I'll make sure that they're available out there for you to download, should you want to do that. So I collect additional stat information, expensive queries, backup history, optimization info. There's a slew of scripts here. Now what I want to show you is that if I come out, and maximize this again, if I come out here and I come to a PSS Diag folder, and this is where this Diag Manager was installed, I have this custom diagnostics folder that was created, and I have My Collectors. All I need to do really is I need to go out and put all my .SQL files here, and then there's this custom Diag XML file. This is where I would go in and I would edit. Okay, it's a real simple schema. Basically, I just need to give it a task name, and I need to give it the actual command. And these are .SQL files. I just name them the same thing, and I say that it is a T-SQL script. I have an option to run these scripts at startup or shut down or incrementally while the SQL Diag is running. I just usually run them at startup. Right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit save. And what that's going to do is it's going to go out and create this cabinet file. I'll call this Tim PSSD.cab. It's going to ask me, do you want to run it for 2008 or 2008 R2? Let's do 2008 R2. That should be fine. So it packaged all those files up, and it put it in a cabinet file, and it put that cabinet file in the customer directory. Okay, so we have this Tim PSSD.file. Now I could run it from here, and that would work just fine, or what I would usually do is I would move it to a different server, and my target SQL server where I have my production instance that I want to capture information from, that's where I'm going to move to. Again, Diag Manager, I don't have this on my production machine. I have this on my laptop somewhere or some sort of miscellaneous server out there that I do analysis on. I don't install this on my production machine. It's going to create this cabinet file for me, and I'm going to move that cabinet file to my production machine, and I'm going to run the diagnostic information there. So let's pretend that I'm going to copy this to a different machine. I have another machine set up. And on this machine, this is actually a machine that I set up in SQL Azure, which is very easy to go and set up collections for. And here it just happens to be called PSSD, and it's a cabinet file. If you are used to working with PFE engineers or someone from CTS, whenever they give you a PSS Diag file, it's going to be a .exe file. At the end of the day, this cabinet file and the .exe file are going to be the exact same thing. Just with this cabinet file, you have to double-click on it, copy everything out. If you have a different way to extract it, and then what I like to do is I like to put it into a different folder. Okay. We call this test. I'm going to copy all that information over there. Now, on this particular machine, I have a SQL Server 2008 R2 instance set up. So right now, at this point, I'm ready to start collecting. So the only thing I have to do is hold down my Shift key, right-click, go to Open Command Window here, and there is a command file here called pssdiag.cmd. Now I can edit that file, and it's going to show me exactly what it takes to run pssdiag, essentially. This is pretty much the same thing as if we were to send that to you from CTS. Okay, so I'm just going to run pssdiag.cmd, and it's going to start capturing information. Now, as it's capturing information, I'm not going to run this for very long. It's going to go look at all of my custom scripts that I wanted it to collect. It's going to run all of those, and it's going to dump them. It's going to dump them. You can see it here, all these custom scripts that I was collecting. It's going to dump them into an output folder. So now it's collecting information. So pretend this is our SQL Server, our production level SQL Server that we're having a problem with. It's collected all this information, and now, say I ran it for an hour or so, since this is pretty lightweight, we're not collecting trace information, we're just really collecting personal information in a few different SQL statements throughout the capture. It's really lightweight, and you could run it. I've had customers that run it for 10, 12 hours at a time when we're trying to find problems without any repercussions from it. It's that trace data that you capture that can bite you. So I'm going to stop it, and it's going to shut down the collector, and it's going to go out, and it's going to dump all that information that we just captured into this brand new output folder that it created here. Now, in this output folder, we have a lot of .out files, and we can come here and we can find out that for this particular system, we had these expensive queries, which is really, there's nothing running on this system right now. And we have, let's look at our backups. There's no backup history, but notice here we have this tag, this -- backup history. If we had data here, we could use this tag in SQL Nexus to load that information up. Okay. Okay, so we're pretty much shut down here. It's going to ask me, do I want to terminate the batch? And yeah, I do. At this point, we're done. If you were collecting this on a SQL Server 2012 or 2014 instance, and you don't have that option in Diag Manager to go collect that through the UI, the only change that you would have to make, and let me come over here to a 2014 instance, the only change that you would really have to make is whenever I expand that folder, there is an XML file out there called pssdiag.xml. Let me find it here. The only thing that I would need to change is, since this is 10.5, if this was SQL Server 2012, I would change this to 11. I would need to change it to 11 here, 11 here, and then 11 here, and then I'm good to go. I can run this on a SQL Server 2012 instance, and it'll work just fine. That's the only thing you need to do. If it was 2014, you just change that to 12. Okay? So that is how you go out and you collect that information with pssdiag, but that's only the first part of the story. That's only the first part of the story. Now we're going to talk about what SQL Nexus is and how we can use SQL Nexus to take advantage of that data that we just collected. Right, so let me swap my presenter view here. So SQL Nexus, also a tool that you go out and you get from Codeplex. And then again, this is not a tool that you're going to install on your production SQL Server. You're going to put this on a laptop somewhere, or you're going to put this on an analysis machine somewhere. And what this is going to do, it is built to take that data that pssdiag or SQL Diag collected and load that up into a database and run reports off of it. Now, one thing you need to be able to use SQL Nexus are these utilities called RML utilities. And you want to go out to Codeplex, and there are links out on Codeplex that point you to the latest version of these RML utilities. And there's actually a new version of SQL Nexus out on Codeplex. Okay. Now the UI for SQL Nexus itself is actually pretty nice. There are a few limitations to it, but it's pretty nice. But the main advantage of SQL Nexus is that with those tags that you embed into those custom SQL scripts of yours that you collected with pssdiag, it can load that information up into a database automatically for you. You don't have to add just a couple of lines you have to add to an XML file. It'll load that information up for you, and then you can run your own reports off of it. So it can take that PSS, or it can take that perfmon information, which is very, very handy, and any of those custom scripts that you gathered, and it gathers a lot of its own information as well. You have this wealth of data that you've collected from a server that is very, very useful into troubleshooting just a wide array of issues. Okay, so you need to go out and you need to download RML utilities, install it on your laptop or wherever you plan to run this from, and then you'll have to install SQL Nexus. Here are a couple of the reports. Now these are the kind of older reports that were from the previous version of SQL Nexus. A lot of these are already there, but it gives you a nice graph of bottleneck or rate analysis. It gives you a nice graph of CPU, and a number of other different reports, and I think they've added a couple of reports recently as well. Now, with SQL Nexus, it has a configuration file as well. Okay. This configuration file, called text row sets custom, this is where you're going to go in and you're going to add that identifier for that custom row set that you created before. So whenever we created that PSS Diag, that through Diag Manager, whenever we went to custom diagnostics, in those SQL files, there's a dash and whatever we wanted to name it. If you look here on my identifier, here's the one that we created for backup history. I have dash backup history. I have a number of other ones as well. I added this to that text row sets custom file. Now, whenever I go and I plan to upload data, SQL Nexus is going to look for these identifiers in those files, and if it sees a row set after it sees that identifier, it's going to go and load that data up, and it's going to put it into whatever table name I give it. In this case, I give it the custom backup history table. Now, doing it this way, it's going to use a very generic data type for all the columns that it loads data into. You can specify those column types, but typically I don't, and I just handle it through my T-SQL scripts. You certainly can do it on your own if you want to. Okay. Did I cover everything here? I did. Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing pretty good on time. We're about 27 minutes in, so we're doing pretty good. Let's go right. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to come back to my analysis machine. This is my, I have SQL Server 2014 loaded on here. It doesn't really matter what you have loaded on your analysis machine because SQL Nexus is going to be able to load that data into that database so long as you have the correct permissions. Now, I've already installed SQL Nexus, and I've actually already loaded up some data from a capture. So I can come out to my Management Studio here, and it'll load it up for me. There we go. Come out to Object Explorer, and I already have a data set that I loaded. We'll go through some of this data in a moment. But I just wanted to tell you that by default, it's going to add this data to the SQL Nexus database if you're using SQL Nexus. However, you do have the option to go and create a new database to load the data into. You just choose New Database, and it'll load it here. I've already created a new database called New Capture, so I'm going to use that. Once I'm in SQL Nexus, I'm going to come down to the Import section. So I click on Import, and here I have the option of going and finding that output file that I want to load data from. The one that I have here is in my PSS Diag data output. This is pretty much the same exact capture that we had before, except I have some additional information in there. Now, what I want you to do is when you're doing this, always click on Options and go to Importers. By default, BLG Blaster is not enabled. You'll want to enable that if you plan to import perfmon data, which I do recommend you doing, because it does a great job of importing perfmon data, and then you can analyze it through some really simple queries. If you're collecting trace information, read trace is enabled by default. If you don't want to import it, sometimes if the capture is really, really large and you did collect trace information, it can take a while to import this. So typically I don't enable it, but I don't have trace information. I'm going to drop the current database before importing, just because it thinks that this database already exists. And then I'll click Import. Actually, you know what? For our purposes here, I'm going to skip the BLG Blaster just because I've already imported this data. I'm going to click Import, It says, are you sure you want to drop this database? Sure. Now what it's going to do, it's going to go out, it's going to look at that folder where we have that data that I collected from that output folder. Let's see if I can find it here. It's going to be on my C drive, and then it's going to be in PS Diag data, output, and then output. It did find a little bit of trace information, so it's loading that trace information up. There shouldn't be a whole lot. Let me see how much trace information I have here. Not a lot, I don't think. Size. But eventually what it's going to do, once it's read all that trace information, it's going to go out, it's going to look at all my out folders, all my out files, and it's going to load those up into my database. So I'm just going to let that churn. I'm going to let it do what it's doing. And what we'll do is we'll come out and we'll look at the tables that it loads data up into. So think of this as a cooking channel where they already have the main dish already cooked. Just for time constraints here, I want to make sure that we're able to get through everything that I want to get through within the next 15 minutes, so I wanted to do that. So any of these tables here that have prefixed in CUST_ are tables that were created by SQL Nexus because it found a tag in one of these files and it noticed that it wanted me to import, it noticed that I wanted it to import information. Okay, so if I actually come out to one of these output folders, and we'll come up to, I think I should have some backup information. We'll go up to index detail, because I know I have some index information here. Trying out on this PC with a notepad. I have index detail with the hash, or the tag index detail. I have a number of columns. And again, these are just custom SQL scripts that I wrote that has information about these particular indexes. And because I have this index detail tag here, SQL Nexus noticed that I wanted to import it, and it put it into this table called index detail. So if I right-click, and we'll just do this real simple here, we'll select the top 1,000 rows, it should have went out and loaded the information from that .out file into this table here. Now, this VM isn't super powerful in the fact that SQL Nexus is still trying to import that trace information. That's what I get for trying to import trace information. The fact that it's doing that, let me X out of it here, is slowing things down a bit. But you can see that it did, in fact, go out and load a bunch of index information for the AdventureWorks database. I have the table, I have the index name, the index for columns, and some additional information based on that index. Now, this was just for a very small sample database out there. You could have ran this on your production system, and again, it's just a DMD query. It's going to dump that information out into a text file that you can load up on a different server and look at all this information without having to go to the server itself and run all these queries manually by hand. Right? So it's a very useful tool to be able to do that kind of thing. Okay. So that's SQL Nexus, again, by editing that configuration file, adding the tags that you wanted to import, it will go out and import whatever data you want into tables without you actually having to go and specify the column names for the data types. Now, the downside of that is that if we go out and we look at this table itself here, we look at the columns, they're all going to be a varchar 255, 256. Okay, it does notice the actual length of the column for you, but that's about it. It's all going to be Unicode, and you can go back and modify that if you wanted to. Usually it's not that big of a deal for me. Okay? So that is us collecting, using the tools to create a capture to collect information, and then actually going out, once we capture that information, to be able to load that data up into a database to run our own custom queries against it. Now, if we did want to write our own custom queries to analyze the perfmon data, and again, perfmon, there are a lot of counters, and it can be tricky from time to time to figure out what counters you want to look at. That's where we have another tool that we can use to analyze that information as well. Let me put this in full screen here. Now we're going to talk about the performance analysis of logs tool, otherwise known as the PAL tool. This is also a tool that you can get from codeplex.com. And what this is going to do is that you can feed the PAL tool a BLG file, or I think you can feed it a CSV file as well, just a perfmon capture. And it's going to go out, it's going to analyze, it's going to pour over that perfmon capture that you gathered, that you fed to it, and it's going to give you some recommendations over, based on whatever threshold file you use. It's going to give you some recommendations, and then it's going to spit out a whole lot of graphs. It's going to spit out some graphs for you, and it's going to give you some really good recommendations on what you need to go and look at. Okay? The bad thing about this tool is that it does take quite a bit of time to analyze these particular logs, so the more perfmon data you have, the longer it's going to take to run through it. But in some cases, it's probably going to be worth it because you may have some underlying problems that you didn't know and you don't know to look for, and the PAL tool is a pretty good tool at finding those for you and pointing them out. The PAL tool, it's written entirely in PowerShell. It does present you a nice little user interface. It presents you with a number of questions for SQL Server. There are a number of threshold files, so this is not just a SQL Server only tool. This threshold file, based on whatever type of system that the perfmon capture came from, and you can see here that a plethora of different threshold files we have, has certain limits and certain alerts in it based on whatever the underlying application is. Whenever you run the PAL tool, you're going to choose either SQL Server 2005 or SQL Server 2008/2008 R2. The new version of the PAL tool has information for SQL Server 2008 R2. I don't think we have 2012 included in this just yet. Whenever you're running PAL, again, this is a tool that you're going to have to go and grab, and you're going to have to install on the server, not on the SQL server, not on your production server, but whatever server you're going to analyze the data from, you're going to have to install this tool on that server, and it'll install just fine as is, but for it to actually go on and create reports and graphs, and you're going to want these graphs, you have to go out and install the MS chart controls. So those are required for it to actually go out and create those graphs. And this is the error that you will receive if you don't have it installed. The output, it creates a fairly lengthy HTML file. And in that file, there are a number of graphs, and based on whatever information is in that threshold file, it will alert you based on something being green, which is okay, something being yellow, which may be a problem, or something being red, which says that's probably going to be an issue for you, and you want to look at it. It will summarize that particular information, and you can click on any of these conditions, and it's going to point you to a graph, and it will tell you, based on whatever the timeline is, when you ran into that particular problem. So in this case here, I'm looking at logical disks, average disk seconds per write, which is disk latency for a write to a disk as encountered by the operating system. And we can see here around, and this is a fairly old capture, on 4.3 in 2013 I had some disk spikes. It jumped all the way up to a little over 1400ths of a second. So maybe a problem that I need to investigate, maybe not, but PAL does a pretty good job of pointing that information out to me so I can go investigate it if I want to. Again, the color itself is coded to let you know what to focus on. The trick here is that this is based upon a particular value at a given time, so it doesn't do trending. So in the SQL world, if you have a server where let's say your page life expectancy is typically around 20,000 seconds, and then it jumps down to maybe 5,000 seconds because someone ran a large scan or something else happened, PAL's not going to point that out for you. Okay, that's something you're going to have to go in to the actual perfmon file and discover on your own. It's only going to point out that, at least in terms of color coding, that it jumps under a certain threshold. It doesn't find trends for you, unfortunately. it would be a pretty neat feature to have, but it's just not built in right now. So you still have to know what to look for. In a lot of cases, I don't use PAL a lot because usually I'm able to go into perfmon, take the DOG file itself, and find what I want to find instead of having to wait for the analysis to go through. But it does, again, create some really nice reports, and it may discover things that I don't usually think to look for. So another benefit or two. So let's take a look at the output from PAL. So what I'll do, discard this here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come out to my analysis machine again, and I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to fire up PAL. Again, I have to install this on the server itself. It'll take a second for it to come up. Hopefully. Well, there we go. So here what you would find, we pick out a counter log, so I'll just go and pick a log file. I'm not going to process through this. I've already processed through it, and we'll look at the report here. I have the threshold file. For our purposes here, since we're looking at a SQL Server machine, I'm going to come down to Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2. It's going to give me a number of, and I can actually edit these. I can edit these files. I can edit these thresholds however I want to edit them. It gives me a nice little UI for going and doing that. Here, I'm just going to take the threshold values that they give me. It's going to give me a number of questions like, what do I want my PLE health threshold to be? Typically, this value, at least historically, it's been around 300. You can modify this value to see whatever you want to here. So if for my given SQL Server, if I want to see where the PLE drops below 1,000 seconds instead of the normal 300 or whatever it's recommended, then I could set that value here. For my OS, is it a 64-bit? And 64 bit's the default, so that's what we're going to go with here. And this actually was a 64-bit machine. How much physical memory was in this machine whenever we perform the capture? We can't really, it doesn't figure it out for us, so we enter it in there. And if this was a 32-bit, are we using user VA, where this is a 64-bit, so we don't care about the user VA option. Most of the other options, I'm going to go with auto on the analysis interval, and I think by default it cuts it up into 30 different time slices. File output, I'm going to give it the default location for, it's going to put it into my documents. Then I'm going to omit the queue portion, and I'm going to hit execute. I've already done this, so I'm going to come over and I'm going to go out to my documents folder. I'm going to go to PAL reports, which is where it creates it by default. And then I'm going to open up this HTML file that's out here. Now, I don't have any glaring problems with this particular output. This is more just to show you the capabilities that you have with PAL. Once this opens it up and renders it, while it's churning through that, I'm going to come back out to this output folder. And in this output folder, we can see all these particular file or image files that it creates. It's these image files that are our graphs. So I can double click on one of these, and it's going to show me a particular, it breaks it up into different time slices, and it shows me the red, the yellow, and what's probably not too worrisome. Okay, but this is what it's going to link to in this HTML file. So here are my time slices that it breaks it out into, and I may or may not have alerts for those particular time slices. I'm going to omit those for now. I'm going to come down and do I have any problems with my logical disk? Well, I might have. So let me click on that, and it's going to take me to that particular counter, and I'm not going to worry about what the values are. What's really, really nice about this tool is the fact that for each one of these counters, there's a really nice description under the counter that describes exactly what that counter tells you. So if you're in perfmon, there's a small blurb in perfmon that goes over what that particular counter value is meant to be. In PAL, they've enhanced a lot of these that gives you a little more additional detail as to what that counter actually is. Okay. So there's a wealth of information here. I didn't have any memory problems. No processor problems. So there's a lot of SQL counters that we could potentially look at. There's a lot of other information that we could look at, and it does do a really nice job of charting everything out based on time slice, so that you can go in and actually dig into whatever the problem may be, and then go and do some research on it. So that's the PAL tool. All right. So when should I use which tool? Well, for the most part, PAL is a pretty decent tool for looking at overall system performance. Again, it's a general purpose tool, so it's not going to be able to discover. Yeah.
We have 5 minutes.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm finishing up here, so we're doing fine. So it's a pretty decent tool for looking at overall system performance. You can use it pretty nicely for benchmarking purposes. So you could set up perfmon to run every 15 seconds throughout the day, capture that for benchmarking purposes, and then maybe once a day or once a week or something, take one of those perfmon outputs and look at it through PAL and see if you see any problems with that. That's a roundabout way to go about doing that type of thing. I would personally use SQL Diag and SQL Nexus, or PSS Diag and SQL Nexus, to go and gather that information and then load that up into a database and run my own custom scripts against the data that I loaded into those tables, so I can perform my own alerts and my own analysis on that data. And that's exactly what I do whenever I capture it from a customer system. So that's the overview. For the most part, I'm done. So what I want you to take away here is, in terms of gathering data, go to CodePlex, check out Diag Manager, play around with Diag Manager, create your own captures, create your own cabinet files, put those cabinet files on a test system somewhere, and play around with the data that you're able to capture. Use this video, which I think they're going to put out on the past site somewhere. Use this video as reference if you need to for the particular files that you may need to go and change around if you want to incorporate your own scripts. And then load that stuff up, load that data up in SQL Nexus, and play around with the data that it actually loads up for you so that you can run your own analysis for it. So because that can save you a lot of time in terms of troubleshooting. It does a lot of work that a lot of the nice tools out there may do for you. The main thing is that it does capture perfmon information, which is very, very useful in terms of troubleshooting a lot of real nasty problems out there. So that's when to use which tool. I hope you got some useful information from this. If you have questions, I'm happy to field them for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So I am done. I hope you enjoyed it. And if there are any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, so Tim, we do have a couple of questions out there. One of the first questions that we're going to ask, it's been asked multiple times, is in regards to making SQL Diag working on SQL 2012 and 2014. Mm-hmm. And subsequent question to that is, if you make that config file change, do you need to make the change again in order for it to work on 2008 R2, etc.? Yeah.
So that change that you make, you can copy that XML file if you wanted to and just have a couple of them around. I mean, they're pretty general purpose. So if you wanted one for 2008, you would just want that, or 2008 R2, you would want that 10.5 in there. And then if you wanted one for 2012, you need the 11, and for 14, you need the 12. So yeah, you either need to go out to Diag Manager, create a new one, and have specific ones for that, or just have folders where you keep all that information. Have like a 2008 R2 folder and all the files for PSS Diag associated with for that version of SQL in that folder. And I would probably do that. I would have a folder for 2008 R2, and one for 2012, and one for 2014. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Okay. Next question is in regards to the script. We know that we will have the video and the PowerPoint, the slide deck, available on 24hoursofpath.com. Again, that's 24hoursofpath.com. It should be available in about a week. But as for the scripts, will those be included with the PowerPoint at that time, or is there another location?
That's a good question. I will do everything I can so that it is on that site. If it's not, then maybe I can load them up to the Microsoft PFE blog so that you can go and download them from there. So we'll make them available either from that site directly, the 24hoursofpath.com site directly, or we'll put a link there that you can go and grab it from the Microsoft blog.
Okay, just going through the questions right here. While I'm getting through the rest of the questions, Your take on a comparison between the use of SQL Diag and the PSS Diag versus extended events.
Oh, that's a good question.
Differences?
Yeah, so with extended events, and hopefully in a future version we will have extended event support in Diag Manager. Extended events is always going to give you a much more in-depth view of what will be occurring on the server, because we have a lot more of events in extended events than we have in SQL Trace, a whole lot more. So if I'm looking for a specific problem, then extended events is definitely the way to go if I know what my problem is, or if I'm looking for a specific event and how long it's taking or something like that. If I want a general overview where I want to go out and I want to see what's going on at my server at the OS level, or I have a certain number of scripts that I want to always run to look at backup history or disk trending purposes, those types of things, then PSS Diag and SQL Nexus is the tool. But if I want a much more pointed analysis where I'm looking for a very specific thing that's occurring, then extended events is the way to go.
Okay. Next question. Where do we find chart controls for PAL?
You should, in the slides, I have a hyperlink to go and download the chart controls.
Okay.
Or you could go. You should be able to go out to Bing and do a search for Microsoft chart controls, and there should be only one. It should be the first thing that comes up. Because I just downloaded a new set of them the other day, so they're really easy to find.
All right. Let's see. Are there any additional queries available in any of the blog locations to go through the data loaded via SQL Nexus?
I'm sure there are. I just have the ones that I use on every time that I run some sort of analysis. There are certainly a number of modifications to those queries or new queries out there that you could use, and it's easy enough to go and take that query, dump it into a .SQL file, and load that information up through one of those XML config files, and it'll capture it on the system anytime that you run it. So use the queries that I gave you as a guide to. I mean, don't just rely upon those queries. Feel free to build your own and modify those queries as you want, and get the information that you feel like you want on your system and feel like that you need to perform the analysis that you want, and then go out and run those queries. So just use everything that I've given you here as a guide.
Yeah, I'm sure there's probably plenty of other queries available via Bing or Google.
Yeah.
Somebody was kind enough to post a blog post there. I might send that to you so you can include it. There's plenty of queries currently available on the PFE blog for configuring custom SQL data collections. So if anybody's interested, they could probably search in the PFE blog for configuring custom SQL data collections, and you should be able to find plenty of material. Looks like we have just one more question right here. What is the observer effect of the PSS Diag tool, and would you be willing to let it run for a longer period? I'm going to say a week, a month, or etc.
So it depends on. It depends. Like there's a process running in the background, and you can find that process through Perfmon if you can go into the processes tab, and you can see how much resources it's eating up. But I would say so long as you're not capturing trace information, and you are capturing it depends on how long you want it to run, right? And it depends on the level in which you are, how often you're capturing the Perfmon captures, and how often you're running those SQL scripts. But I have customers right now that run it for 18, 20 hours at a time. They don't run it during like their maintenance window, but they run it pretty much all day, and they keep like a week's worth. And they end up being somewhat large in size because they take they keep the Perfmon data just at the amount that I capture. You don't have to capture that much Perfmon data if you want to capture it around the clock. I mean, a lot of that Perfmon data you're not going to need. I capture it typically just in case I do need it, but if you know your system pretty well, you don't have to capture all that. So I wouldn't have any problem running it around the clock because that Perfmon data, even if you wanted to scale it back to capturing every 20 seconds or 15 seconds, captures it at every 5 seconds by default, I wouldn't have any problem capturing it 24 hours at a time. I've not done it a week at a time, but so long as you are pointing it out to a disk that has plenty enough free space, because it's going to capture some data for you, I wouldn't have a problem with it. No. It's the trouble that you get into is whenever you're capturing a lot of SQL trace events, and it can really add a lot of overhead to the system. That's the main problem that you can get into.
Okay. And we are coming right up against the end here. So many people have said thank you, and we appreciate what you've put together here for us. And if we could go ahead and advance to the next slide so we can get this wrapped up.
All right. Well, that's all I've got. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I appreciate your questions, and hopefully I'll see you at PASS.
Yeah, I thought there was one slide in there to remind people that you do have a pre-con at PASS.
Yep.
And that you also have another session at PASS. So go ahead and check him out at Summit. And again, thanks to everybody for coming.
Thanks, everyone.